Global growth is slowing sharply in the face of elevated inflation, growing interest rates, reduced investment, and disruption caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, according to the World Bank's latest Global Economic Prospects report. Today, my guest is Cristina Savescu, a senior economist for EU for the World Bank. And today we'll take a closer look on the Poland's economy and the forecast for 2023. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, so we have a fresh report on the table, your flagship report, Global Economic Prospects. So what are the main takeaways for the global economy for 2023?
So one of the key takeaways is that we will see a very sharp, broad-based deceleration in growth, in global growth. We have revised downwards the forecast for 95% of the advanced economies and around 70% of the emerging and developing economies, and the revision in global growth is sharp to 1.7% from 3% only 6 months ago, so for 2023. So that's a very sharp deceleration in global growth. And as you mentioned already, we have aggressive monetary policy tightening in response to elevated inflation. We have weak confidence and subdued investment. We have the energy crunch in Europe that contributes to this deceleration in global growth. And for advanced economy, we have revised down the growth projections from 2.5% in 2022 to 0.5% in 2023. And decelerations of these types in the last 2 decades have foreshadowed global recession. So we see an increase in the risks of a global recession for 2023. We have downgraded growth in both the US and the euro area by close to 2 percentage points to 0% in the euro area and 0.5% in the US. And that will have, of course, repercussions through demand for imports from emerging and developing economies. And then, of course, we expect inflation to be higher for longer. Although we do see some disinflation process in advanced economies as some of the commodity prices respond to weaker growth, inflation is higher than previously expected, and the energy price shock is still working through the price dynamics in many of the countries.
Mm-hmm. So, for example, when looking at the EU economy and Eurozone, you also think that the peak of the inflation is ahead of us?
Yeah, so we don't necessarily focus, we focus primarily in developing countries and emerging economies and less so on the dynamics in the advanced economies. But of course, that is very important for the context, for the external context for developing countries. And yes, we expect to see a peak perhaps in the first quarter of 2023 and then a gradual disinflation process for the remainder of the year. That being said, we saw inflation coming down in the euro area to 9.2% in December from a peak of 10.7% in October. But we also saw core inflation reaching a record high of 5.2% in December. So that is basically showing that inflation pressures remain relatively high, well above the targeted range for inflation targeting countries.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move to Poland now. Obviously, the challenges are also ahead of us, and we are not going to avoid them. Mm-hmm. So, and actually your forecast was quite significant decline of the forecast to only 0.7% of the growth. So why do you expect such a significant growth? What are the factors? War in Ukraine?
There are multiple factors actually that sort of combine to give this result. First of all, let's acknowledge that the recovery from the COVID crisis in Poland has been much stronger than initially expected, and there were growth revisions, historical growth revisions for 2021, for example, and 2022 was a strong outturn as well, where actually stronger than market had expected in some cases. So we have a very strong base effect to begin with for 2022. And then, of course, we have this combination of factors, the monetary policy tightening in response to very high inflation. We have more or deterioration in global financing conditions in general, a weak investment sentiment, and of course, given the high inflation that we've seen so far, we expect quite significant deceleration in growth in private consumption, which is one of the main contributor from an accounting point of view to growth in Poland as well as in other countries. So we have a sharp deceleration in private consumption due to high inflation, due to rising interest rates, and we also see a more difficult or complicated environment for investment. We actually, for the economy as a whole, we expect relatively flat, if not slightly declining investment, and I think it's primarily due to private investment deceleration. We have also the unwinding of the inventory cycle. Inventory building has contributed quite significantly to growth in 2022, and I think companies will start drawing down on some of those inventories, especially since the global supply disruptions are easing, and since we also see this deceleration in consumption, in private consumption. And then, of course, let's not forget that we expect flat growth in euro area, and so that means the external demand is also going to slow down for Polish exports, for example. So it's a combination of factors that have resulted in this downgrade in growth, but it's, I think, in line with the revisions, downward revisions in other countries, in peer countries, and so forth for Poland.
Yeah, of course, you are expecting the deepest slowdown since 2020. But what about the recovery, mid-recovery that you expect actually for 2024? What are the medium-term strengths of the Polish economy, and which factors bring downside risks?
So, Polish economy has proven resilient to multiple shocks. We've seen, there was a contraction in output, but it was relatively shallow compared to other countries. And that speaks to the strengths of the Polish economy. It's a well-diversified economy. It is competitive. It has some strong fundamentals that have enabled this really strong growth for the past decades or so. I mean, it is a success story, Polish, in terms of growth and income convergence. And those structural factors continue to play in favor of Poland. Of course, a well-qualified labor force with good educational attainments, it's also an important factor for attracting investments into Poland. So all those factors exist and will continue to support the Polish economy. There are, of course, also risks, and of course, the geopolitical risks cannot be underestimated. We see that the risk of an intensification in the war in Ukraine cannot be discounted. So, and that will have repercussions, of course, on growth outlook for the countries in the region and beyond.
Of course, we have still the question mark how that will work in the future. Yes, unfortunately, we cannot predict the fast end of the war.
And another risk, a downside risk is, and again, that also is not just for Poland but globally, the risk of policy missteps. So very high inflation and repeated supply side shocks have complicated the task of policymakers to basically be able to calibrate the policies to ensure that there is a soft landing, for example. So that risk of policy missteps is also present.
Okay, you as a World Bank, you are engaged in many projects in Poland. So what are your priorities for 2023?
Our priorities for 2023 and beyond is to support Poland in its process of green transformation. I think that is one of our important corporate priorities, and we have several projects that will help hopefully with that process. We think that that's an important area to be engaged in. We also have as an objective, as a priority, to support the building of institutions regionally and nationally to ensure that the adaptation to climate change and the mitigation of this climate risk is done properly and in an inclusive in an inclusive way. We are also providing support for long-term care basically in Poland. So these are some of the areas we want to encourage evidence-based policy making. So we have different projects that provide sort of the analytics that might help with that. And of course, entrepreneurship and private sector development is also at the core of our objectives.
Okay, so let's maybe focus on the first thing you mentioned, which is energy transition. That's on the tongues of everyone. It can have a significant input to our growth and the development in the future, and when we will be in 5 years, for example, time. Actually, at the end of 2022, you published a report focused on Poland, the green transformation in Poland, opportunities and challenges for economic growth. So what are the main takeaways? What actually Poland has to do to fully capitalize on the opportunities offered by the green transformation?
So indeed, we finished that report, and I think it has been quite well received, if I may say so. And some of the key takeaways is that in order to engender an ambitious transformation, more ambitious strategies are needed, and there are still some regulatory gaps that need to be addressed in order to fully take advantage of the opportunities for the green transformation. So we focused in particular on the decarbonization of the power sector, and some of the findings there is basically that the investment needs are significant, and if Poland were to adopt a more ambitious decarbonization path, the investment needs could be twice as high as in the business as usual scenario. So ensuring the financing of that is also important. And for that, the policy environment needs to be stable. Some of these barriers to investments in renewables need to be addressed. There is an important aspect of the grid infrastructure also that has to be considered. But also on the policy and regulatory side, ensuring easier access to connections to the grid, for example, is important and can be, it should be more transparent and more rapid. And then also we find that the policy support has to be sort of expanded to ensure a scale up in the deployment of renewable energy. So these are some of the findings that, of course, there are quite a few, so I won't go through all of them, but some of the key takeaways.
Yeah, but of course, from what you've said, a lot of this is on the state side, but what's the place for the private investment in this area?
These investment needs are so large, they cannot be financed solely from public, nor should they be solely from public money, but the policy environment is really important for that. So ensuring a level playing field for investors is important. Ensuring addressing some of these regulatory barriers, for example, including for special planning, are important to allow market participants to enter this particular market. And of course also support in managing the risks that are associated with this type of investment, as well as additional policy support could incentivize the investments from the and crowd in investments from the private sector. But again, investment needs are large, and especially if one considers, for example, the nuclear power, those investment needs become even larger. So of course, the financing becomes important.
Okay, well, thank you. We need to finish, but it was very, very interesting discussion, and thank you very much for this quick wrap-up of the global economy and the Polish forecast for 2023. Well, what I can say at the end is just to wish that, as previously, Poland has proved resilience to several shocks in the past, better than the market expected and the experts expected. Let's hope that it will be the case again this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.